Welcome back to the Deep End. I hope you're ready because today we are looking at something, something massive. And I mean that quite literally, but also figurative. We're going to be doing a deep dive into a documentary and a set of really heavy transcripts that are collectively titled 80 Ton.
It's a really striking title, isn't it? 80 Ton. It immediately gives you a sense of the sheer weight involved.
Right.
You think of the weight of explosives, of course, but it's also about the weight of the decisions, the weight of history, the burden on everyone involved.
Exactly. And to set the stage for everyone listening, we are looking at a very specific and I think very intense slice of recent history. We're analyzing the conflict on Israel's northern border, and the timeline we're covering is from the absolute shock of October 2023 all the way through the end of 2024.
A truly transformative period.
It really was. But here's the thing. As I was going through this source material, I kept getting stopped in my tracks because the language that the commanders and the intelligence officers use, it just doesn't match the headlines I remember reading at the time.
And that's such a common disconnect, isn't it? We often consume these events through news tickers and push notifications.
Yeah, exactly. Border skirmishes,
escalations, exchanges of fire. It all sounds very contained, very tit for tat. But the source material, this 80-ton documentary, it gives us the internal view. The people on the ground, the brigade commanders, the intel analysts, the local security chiefs, they are not calling this a skirmish.
Not at all.
They describe it in no uncertain terms as the Third Lebanon War.
That is a huge reframe. Just hearing those words, Third Lebanon War, it changes everything.
Right.
And they talk about it as this strange, evolving beat. It didn't start with a bang, like a standard invasion. It started as this high-stakes chess match, which we really need to unpack. And then it just morphed into this chaotic, transformative conflict that, according to the source, changed the security doctrine of the entire region from end to end.
And I think that has to be the core mission of our deep dive today. We have to understand that shift. This isn't just going to be a timeline of they shot, we shot.
Right.
It's a story about the complete collapse of a concept. We're going to explore what the source calls the battle for time, which is a fascinating and frankly a terrifying idea, and the really intense psychological warfare that was involved.
Plus some of these tech operations that, they honestly sound like they were written for a spy novel. But they were very, very real.
The pager operation, yes. We'll definitely get to that. Yeah. But ultimately, what we're tracing here is how a long-standing policy of containment it crumbled in the face of a reality that could no longer be contained or ignored.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this because that phrase you just used, battle for time, it comes up over and over again in these transcripts. It really feels like the heartbeat of this entire story. But before we get to the actual fighting in late 2023 or 2024, I think we have to rewind.
We have to.
The source material takes us back, way back, to the period between 2006, right after the Second Lebanon War ended, and 2023, 17 years.
This context is the absolute foundation. If you don't understand those 17 years of quiet, you can't possibly understand the explosion that followed. The source describes this period as the incubation of a monster.
A monster. That is a very specific, very emotive word for military commanders to be using. It's not technical jargon.
It is, but it really reflects the psychological reality they were living with. See, after 2006, there was a widespread sense in Israel that they had achieved deterrent border.
I remember that. If you visited the north in, say, 2015 or 2018, it was beautiful.
Yeah.
You saw wineries, you saw tourism, you saw new neighborhoods being built right up to the border fence.
It felt peaceful.
It felt peaceful.
Exactly. But the source quotes a commander who describes it perfectly. He calls it a battle of mind. He says Israel felt it was winning the tactic. They were foiling drug smuggling attempts. They were stopping the occasional person trying to infiltrate. Every time they caught a guy jumping the fence, they marked it up as a win.
So they're looking at the scoreboard on the wall, and they're thinking, hey, we're up 10 here. We're doing great.
Precisely. But strategically, Hezbollah and Iran were playing a completely different sport on a different field. They were building a massive underground and semi-official military infrastructure right under everyone's noses.
So while Israel is high-fiving over stopping one guy with a backpack, Hezbollah is digging tunnels and pouring concrete for command bunkers.
That's the disconnect. And there's this quote that really stood out to me, too. One of the speakers says, Lebanon fell captive to this armed organization. It paints this picture where the actual country of Lebanon, the state, it almost ceased to be the sovereign power in the south. And this terror army, as they call it, just took over the shell of the state and built its own fortress.
And that distinction is crucial, right? This source makes it really clear that Hezbollah stopped being just a guerrilla group hiding in the bushes with RPG.
They became a proper army, a terror army, as the source put. They had divisions, command structures, advanced weapons, and all of this leads us to the central concept that defined the era, the equation.
The equation. I feel like I heard this term thrown around a lot in the news over the years, but I never really grasped the mechanics of it. It sounds like some kind of math problem.
Well, it's a math problem where the variables are human lives and political capital. The equation was this mutual, unwritten understanding of violence.
An unspoken agreement.
An unspoken agreement. Israel was, for the most part, extremely cautious. The source notes that Israel's leadership actively avoided escalation in the north, quiet and prosperous. They wanted the economy to keep humming. Tourists.
So the logic was basically, if we don't hit them too hard, they won't hit us. A kind of mutually assured restraint.
Precise. You shoot at an empty field, we shoot at an empty outpost. You fire a rocket that lands harmlessly, we conduct a surgical strike on an empty weapon. It was, in some ways, performative violence designed to de-escalate.
But that caution had a side effect.
A huge one. It allowed Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, to build immense confidence. He started to believe, according to the source's analysis, that Israel was genuinely afraid of a real confrontation.
So while Israel is thinking we are responsibly managing this conflict, Nasrallah is looking at the same situation and thinking they are terrified. I can build whatever I want and they won't stop me.
He read their caution as weakness. It's a classic case of misinterpretation. And what he built during that long, quiet period was the absolute nightmare scenario that kept Israeli commanders up at night. The thing mentioned all through the transcript, the Radwan.
Okay, let's drill down on the Radwan Force, because the numbers here are genuinely terrifying. The source doesn't talk in hypothetical. It details a specific invasion plan.
It does. It was the reference scenario that the Israeli military finally started to wake up to in the years just before this all kicked off. This wasn't about a few rockets being fired over the border.
No.
This was about thousands of highly trained commanders. The Radwan Force is their special operations unit, their best of the best, crossing the border simultaneously.
2,000 to 3,000 operatives, the source says.
2,000 to 3,000. And they had everything. They had motorcycles for speed, ATVs, pickup trucks with machine guns mounted on them. Their plan wasn't just to raid a village and run back. Their plan was to conquer the Galilee.
Conquer. That's the word they used. Not raid, not attack.
No, the source is crystal clear on this point. The plan was to seize Israeli towns, take over military bases, and hold them. To shift the battlefield decisively onto Israeli soil, create a massive hostage crisis.
And this brings us right back to that terrifying phrase, the battle for time. The transcript mentions this chilling realization that commanders had before the war even started. They looked at the math and they realized they were losing the race.
It was a simple, brutal calculation that just did not add up. The source details that doctrinally, the standard procedure, it took the Israeli army roughly 36 hours to fully mobilize its reserve force and set up what they call a hermetic defense in the north.
36 hours. That's a day and a half.
Right. You have to call people up from their jobs. They have to get to their bases, get their gear, get organized, and then drive all the way up to the northern border. It takes time.
Okay, so 36 hours to get ready to defend.
But the intelligence showed that the Radwan Force, because they were living and training right on the border, 24/7, they only needed about 6 hours from getting the go order to launching a full-scale attack.
Okay, wait. Let me do the math here. 36 hours to defend, 6 hours to attack. That is a 30-hour gap.
A 30-hour gap. A window of vulnerability where the door to the north was, for all intents and purposes, wide.
That is just a chilling thought.
It kept the commanders awake at night. The source describes this frantic, almost obsessive effort in 2022 and 2023 to fix this problem. They realized their standard procedures just weren't good enough. They had to completely overhaul the entire divisional infrastructure for receiving and deploying troops.
And they mentioned these specific drills, right? There was one in December 2022 and another in 2023. They were practicing these rapid deployments, moving entire brigades from the Golan Heights to the western defense lines.
And that training, that single-minded obsession with closing that time gap, turned out to be arguably the most critical factor in what happened next.
Right.
They managed, through this Herculean effort, to cut the mobilization time down from 36 hours to somewhere between 6 and 12 hours.
So they were trying to match the enemy's speed. They were racing the clock.
Exactly. They were trying to get on equal footing in the battle for time, and the source strongly implies that this specific work shaving off those precious hours might have been the single thing that prevented an unimaginable catastrophe on October 7th.
So let's go there. Let's talk about October 7th, 2023. The source material gives us these incredibly personal, almost minute-by-minute stories of commanders at home. It's a holiday morning, they turn on the TV or they start getting messages on their phones, and they see the first videos coming out of the south from the Gaza border.
And the reaction that's ascribed in the source wasn't just horror or shock, it was professional recognition. One commander says he looked at the screen, he saw the Hamas invasion tactics, the paragliders, the trucks, the storming of bases, and he immediately looked north. His first thought was, it's happening here too.
Because the plan that Hamas executed in the south, it was essentially a carbon copy of the Radwan plan for the north, wasn't it?
It was almost identical in its core concept. The Radwan plan was expected to be much larger, much more professional, and frankly far more lethal. But the blueprint was the same. So the assumption in the Northern Command was immediate and absent. If they're doing it in the south, the north is going to erupt in minutes, not hours.
The source has this great line, the stopwatch was pressed. I just love that imagery. There was zero patience, zero time for deliberation.
It was this strange mix of absolute chaos and perfect clarity. Commanders were literally jumping into their private cars in their weekend clothes, driving from their homes straight to the front lines, fully expecting to meet an invasion force on the highway.
Wow.
They were mobilizing the reserve units via WhatsApp and personal phone calls before the formal orders had even fully cascaded down the chain of command. They knew they had zero margin for error. They were racing that 6-hour clock, and the countdown had already started.
The invasion never came. I mean, not on that day. We know now that the North didn't get overrun on October 7th. Why not? That's the big question.
That is the million-dollar question that the source really tries to analyze. And the consensus from the experts and commanders in the transcript is that Nasrallah was surprised.
He was surprised by his own allies in Hamas. How is that possible?
It seems counterintuitive, but the assessment is that he did not know that Hamas had the capacity or the specific intention to launch an operation of that staggering scale on that specific day. He was caught completely off guard. He wasn't part of the final go.
So he saw what was happening and he hesitated.
He hesitated, and in that critical window of hesitation, or maybe you're talking about just a few hours of indecision, he saw something that likely changed his entire calculation. He looked across the border and he saw the Israeli army flooding the north at a speed he had never anticipated.
The drills.
The battle for time paid off in the most dramatic way possible. By the time Hezbollah might have been organizationally ready to join the fight and open a second front, Israel had already deployed a massive defensive force to the border. The element of surprise, which is the attacker's single greatest weapon, was gone. He missed his win.
But that left everyone in this incredibly tense, weird position, right? Like you have two massive armies mobilized for war, staring at each other across a fence. Israel is ready to defend. The source makes this admission that I found really honest and, frankly, kind of terrifying. A senior commander says they couldn't guarantee a hermetic defense.
And that is a very, very difficult thing for a military leader to admit, especially publicly. What he's saying is that even with the entire army mobilized, when you're facing nearly 3,000 potential invaders across a long border, you cannot promise that not a single terrorist will breach the defense town.
You can't promise there won't be a massacre in the north, just like there was in the south.
You can't promise. The risk was still unacceptably high. And this realization leads directly to one of the most controversial decisions of the entire period, the evacuation of the northern gates.
Yes, the source spends a lot of time on. The logic, as they explain it, was brutal but simple.
It was. We cannot risk a massacre of civilians like the one we just... So to take that risk off the table entirely, they decided to empty the towns and villages close. It was a strategic retreat of the civilian population to save lives.
But it came at a huge cost to morale and to the national spirit.
An immense cost. Which brings us to one of the most compelling stories in the entire documentary. It brings us to the Iron Ducks.
Yeah, story. I found this part so powerful.
It really is. It encapsulates the whole...
So just to paint a picture for you, Metula is a town that's literally right on the fence. It's beautiful, normally full of tourists, and now it's a ghost town. Almost everyone is being told to evacuate. But there's this local civilian security squad, the Keto Konanet, and the source interviews their leader, an older, very determined man.
And the dynamic he describes is fascinating. He talks about going to visit a company of regular army soldiers who were stationed there to protect. The young company commander, trying to be welcoming, says to him, "Welcome to the Iron Duck."
And the old security squad leader just looks at him and says, "You're not Iron Ducks, you're sitting ducks."
It's such a raw, honest moment. Because that's what they were. They were static targets in a deserted town. But the squad leader's resolve is the key to the story. He refused to leave. He said of the young soldiers, "I could be their father." He felt that if his local security squad, the men who actually lived there, packed up and left, the soldiers would feel completely abandoned.
And that the enemy would see a totally empty town and just walk right in.
Exactly. He says in the transcript, "We are not leaving. We are not abandoning our home." It's this profound theme of abandonment versus resilience. But it wasn't just about heroic speeches. The next few months were an absolute grind. The source describes this period as incredibly frustrating for the soldiers on the ground.
This is the holding pattern phase. The source also calls it the battle for learning. You have tens of thousands of reservists who dropped everything, rushed to the border, ready for a fight, and then they were told to wait.
Wait. That's the direct quote that keeps coming up. And while they're waiting in their positions, they are getting shot at constantly.
And not just shot at with rifles. This is what's so brutal. The source details a relentless campaign of anti-tank missile fire. These are sophisticated, guided missiles being fired directly into their posts at their vehicle.
The soldiers were sitting in these static defensive positions, unable to maneuver, just absorbing fire day after day, week after.
So my question is why? Why did they just sit there and take it? It sounds almost suicidal to just sit in a concrete box while someone is methodically shooting guided missiles at you.
It was a strategic decision made at the highest levels. The national focus, the main military effort, was on Gaza. The decision at the national level was to prioritize the war in the south and contain the north. So in the north, the goal wasn't to win a decisive war, not yet. The goal was what the military calls mowing the grass.
Explain that term for us, mowing the grass. It sounds so mundane for something so deadly.
It's a term that's been used for years. It means degrading the enemy's capabilities slowly over a long period without launching a full-scale invasion. Israel was using this time to hunt specific Hezbollah assets, strike key infrastructure, and peel away their capabilities layer by layer, all while trying to keep the conflict below a certain threshold, all-out war.
But for the individual soldier in that outpost, it doesn't feel strategic. It feels like you're just a target in a shooting gallery.
That's the tactical disadvantage the source talks about. You are sitting still, you are on the defensive, and the other guy has the initiative. They choose when and where to shoot.
And this must have just built up an incredible amount of pressure.
Immense pressure. The soldiers were frustrated and angry. The displaced civilians who had been evacuated for months were angry. The old equation of quiet, tit-for-tat fire was becoming unbearable for the Israeli side. The source says the security reality had to change from end, and that change really started to accelerate summer.
Okay, so let's fast forward to July 2024. We're climbing the escalation ladder. The source says that by June, the policy had already started to shift in small ways. The rules of engagement were becoming looser. The orders were essentially, if it threatens you, or if it even looks like a threat, you hit it.
The restraints were definitely coming off. The patience was wearing thin. But the real turning point, the moment the source identifies as the absolute break in the time, was the tragic Marshall.
And it's really important to look at the sequence of events the source provides here, because it wasn't a random act. It started with a specific Israeli operation.
That's right. The source details that a specific unit, the 769th Brigade, working with the 91st Division, killed 4 Radwan operatives in a targeted strike in a Lebanese village called Kafar Kila. This was a classic mowing the grass up, taking key enemy personnel.
And Hezbollah, still operating according to their old equation, felt they had to retaliate in kind.
Right. They have this blood-for-blood logic. If you kill our fighters, we must strike a military target of yours. So they aimed a heavy rocket at a military camp in the Mount Hermon sector, but, as the source puts it in very stark terms, they had an
catastrophic overshoot. They missed the military base, and instead, the missile slammed into a community soccer field in the Druze town of Majd al-Shams.
An absolute tragedy. 12 children just playing soccer were killed. And that was the moment everything changed. The source quotes a senior official saying, completely unequivocally, the security reality had to change from end to end.
It's almost like that one tragic missile killed the equation itself, along with those victims.
It did. There was no more appetite for tit for tat. The decision was made at that point to stop mowing the grass and to go for the head of the snake.
And this is where the entire story shifts on a dime. It goes from a grinding defense to a very calculated, very high-tech, and very aggressive offense. We move from the battle for time to what we could probably call the battle for psychology.
An excellent way to put it.
And, oh man, this is the part of the transcript that just reads like a movie script, the pager operate. The source literally calls it a startup nation moment, but a strictly military one.
What's really fascinating here is the timeline they reveal. This wasn't some improvised spur-of-the-moment idea. The source says that the planning for this and the fierce debate about when to actually use this began as early as April 24.
So they had this red button capability for months. They knew they had the ability to remotely detonate thousands of communication devices used by Hezbollah, and they were just sitting on it, debating when the right moment would be to press it.
Can you imagine being in that room? The source says they debated it endlessly. Should it be the opening blow of a massive war? Should it be used as a deterrent to prevent a war? What was the optimal moment to use this incredible strategic asset?
And when they finally did it in September 2024, the effect was devastating. But notice how the experts in the source analyzed. It wasn't just about the physical injuries. It wasn't just about taking a few thousand fighters off the battlefield for a while.
No, that was almost secondary.
It was the paranoia, the psychological collapse. The source describes Hezbollah operatives suddenly being afraid to drive their own cars because they thought the battery might explode. They were afraid to answer their phones. They were terrified of sleeping in their own homes.
The quote from the transcript is, "The enemy was hurt worse then it completely blinded the organization. Think about it. If you cannot trust your page, can't trust your walkie-talkie or your cell phone, you cannot command troops, can't coordinate an attack, you can't organize a defense. You are effectively deaf and dumb.
It completely severed their command and control infrastructure right at the most critical moment imaginable.
Exactly. Israel blinded the monster right before it drew its sword.
And that sword was Operation Northern Arrows. This happened just a few days later, right? The timeline is very compressed.
Very. On September 23, 2024, and the source gives us the raw numbers, nearly 2,000 munitions were launched by Israel in a single 24-hour.
2,000 munitions. I mean, it's hard to even comprehend that amount of firepower in such a short time.
It is an incredible concentration of force, and the goal was extremely specific. They weren't just carpet bombing South Lebanon. The intelligence work behind this was immense. They destroyed approximately 70% of Hezbollah's long-range firing capability, specifically the rockets and missiles that were aimed at the Israeli home front, at the major city.
And the source makes a very deliberate point to contrast this with the war in 2006. They say this time it was precise. They highlight the massive effort that was made to warn Lebanese civilians to evacuate specific areas, even specific buildings, where Hezbollah was known to be hiding cruise missiles in residential houses.
That's a key part of the modern military doctrine that's being described here. They wanted to strip Hezbollah of its military assets without causing the kind of mass civilian casualty event that often forces a premature end to a war due to international pressure. They wanted to systematically dismantle the monster. They were surgically removing its fangs and claws.
And then, after removing the fangs and claws, they went for the brain, the ultimate dismantling, the end of Nasrallah.
The source paints this really striking picture of Nasrallah in his final day. Quite powerful. He's completely isolated. His top commanders, the entire leadership of the Radwan Force, are either dead or completely cut off.
His communication network is a wreck because of the pager op. His long-range firepower is decimated. He's cornered.
But the source says he was still trapped. The conception.
That's the same term they use for the failure to predict the October 7th attack in the South.
It's the exact same psychological trap. It's the idea that your enemy will behave according to a set of rules that you have created in your own mind. Even as the bombs were falling all around him, Nasrallah apparently still believed that Israel didn't actually want war.
He thought they were still playing by the old rules.
He believed this would stop before it reached him personally. He was still living in the world of equation, thinking he was untouchable.
But the equation was dead.
The equation had been buried in Majlis Sham, and the source describes his assassination as a defining. It wasn't just about killing a single leader. It was about removing the singular figure who had personally built this monster over the course. It was the symbolic and operational end of an entire era.
So you have the pagers blinding them, the massive airstrikes breaking their firepower, the decapitation of the leadership. The monster is blind, it's bleeding, and it's headless, but the job still isn't done.
No. Because you can't clear a border from the air. You can't dismantle an underground tunnel network with a fight. This brings us to the final grueling phase described in the source, the ground maneuver.
This is where the boots finally hit the ground in southern Lebanon. And the source talks about the mission being to literally change the landscape.
The mission shifted from strikes to clearing, physically clearing the military infrastructure that had been built. The source is very specific about not leaving a single house that terror at.
So they were going village by village, house by house.
Village by village, dismantling the tunnels, the bunkers, the hidden launch pads that had been meticulously built up over those 15 years of quiet. It was about ensuring that this threat could not just regenerate in a few months.
And this has to connect back to the morale of the soldiers on the ground. Remember how frustrated they were for months? Wait.
And now, finally, they had the green light. The source describes a battle for spirit that was finally won. The reservists, who had been feeling like hunted ducks in their static posts, suddenly became the hunters.
They were taking the initiative.
They were finally doing what they had been mobilized to do 9 months earlier, to proactively protect their homes by physically removing the threat from.
It's a massive psychological shift from absorb, to attack.
And that fundamental shift is what the source argues was ultimately necessary. The main lesson that the expert speaker in the documentary draws from this entire year-long saga is that containment of a monster doesn't work.
You can't manage it.
You cannot manage a threat that is existential. Eventually, you have to confront. You cannot live with a gun pointed at your head forever. and just hope it never goes off.
The source concludes with this interesting mix of optimism and very hard-nosed realism. There's a really beautiful sentiment from one of the commanders about the Iron Ducks and the residents finally returning to their home. He says, "The North will bloom again."
It is an optimistic note and a necessary, but it's an optimism that's grounded in a very harsh reality. The Third Lebanon War, as they call it, was brutal and costly, but it was seen as necessary to reset the clock, to physically push the threat back from the border so that normal life could eventually return.
But it does leave us with a very heavy question as we wrap this up.
It does. The source ends with a thought about the nature of knowledge. It says, knowledge is valuable only when it is applied.
Right. And they're pointing out that the intelligence community, the military, they knew about the threat for years. They knew that the Radwan Force was training. They saw the monster growing day by day. But they were caught in that battle for time, essentially delaying the inevitable confrontation.
So the really provocative question for us and for you listening is this. If the battle for time was the critical factor here, if the long delay in acting was what allowed the monster to grow so large and so dangerous, what other stopwatches are currently?
That is a chilling thought. What other fronts are we, sort of ignoring or containing? What other monsters are being managed right now just waiting for their own timer to finally hit zero?
It forces you to completely rethink the entire concept of a quiet border, because silence isn't always peace. Sometimes silence is just the sound of the enemy reloading.
Well, on that very heavy note, thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's a lot to process, but understanding how this conflict evolved from a managed chess match to a total all-out dismantling is, I think, crucial to understanding the realities of the region today.
Imagine a stopwatch. I don't mean the one on your phone, the clean digital interface. I mean an old school one, a heavy plastic thing held in a sweaty palm.
Yeah, you could almost feel the click of the button.
Exact. And you press that start button, the numbers just start racing. 00, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. And it's completely silent, but you can feel this urgency building with every single flicker of the display.
Stressful image.
It is. But now I want you to imagine that stopwatch isn't timing a 100-meter dash. It's not for a race car. It's measuring the exact, precise amount of time you have left before your entire world quite literally explodes.
That is a visceral, almost suffocating place to start.
But it's not our metaphor. That is exactly how a senior commander in the Northern Command described the reality on the Israeli-Lebanese border for years.
It really sets the stakes. He says, and I'm quoting this directly from the source because it's the anchor for our whole discussion today, "The stopwatch is pressed. Zero patient. Today, zero. I see the wall exploding. I see the wall exploding." That phrase, that captures the entire psychology we need to unpack today. We're looking at a specific commander who, on the morning of October 7th, is watching the absolute horror unfold in Gaza in the south.
Right.
But he doesn't just watch it like the rest of us did with horror. He immediately, instinctively whips his head to the north because he is convinced, down to his bones, that the exact same nightmare is about to be unleashed from Lebanon.
But worse.
On a scale that would make Gaza look like a dress rehearsal.
And that brings us to the mission for today's deep dive. We are tearing into a source document titled 80 Ton. It's a powerful documentary account of what we are calling, for the purpose of this analysis, the Third Lebanon War.
A war this is what's so fascinating, really started in the shadow. It started long, long before the first tanks rolled across the border or the jets really took off in force.
So today, we're going to unpack how that security equation between Israel and Hezbollah shifted. I mean, how did it go from a policy of containment, basically just keeping a lid on things, tolerating the completely intolerable to one of decisive action? This all happens between 2006 and late 2020.
And there's some huge questions we need to get into. The source really tries to answer three big ones. First, how on earth did Hezbollah grow into what the commanders themselves call a monster?
Right. And second, the one everyone asks, why didn't they attack on October 7th? I mean, Israel was on its knees. It seemed like the perfect moment.
Perfect moment. And finally, how did a very specific, almost surgical set of intelligence and military operations, including those infamous pagers, completely dismantle their command structure?
It really is a case study in military strategy and psychology, and I guess the incredibly high prioritization.
And our source material for this, it's incredibly detailed. We're talking about direct testimonies from Northern Command officers, from local security squad leaders, the actual guys living on the border, rifle in hand, and military analysts piecing it all together.
So it covers the whole timeline. From the moment the dust settled on the Second Lebanon War in 2006, all the way through the pager operation, and right up to the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah. So buckle up. This is a story about a battle for time, a battle for spirit, and the complete shattering of a...
Let's start with the context then, because to really understand the explosion of 2024, you first have to understand the 18 years of, silence that came before it.
The Second Lebanon War, 2006. I remember at the time the general feeling, the consensus, was that Israel had taken a hit. Sure, it was messy, but ultimately they reestablished deterrence.
That was the narrative. It really was. The feeling inside Israel immediately after 2006 was, if not outright victory, then at least, a job well done.
A sense of accomplishment.
Yeah, they felt they'd pushed Hezbollah back north of the Litani River. They thought the border was secure, it was quiet, but the source makes it brutally clear. That feeling was an illusion. It eroded over time, and it eroded because of a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy.
A misunderstanding in what way? What were they getting wrong?
Well, over those next 18 years, the perception shifted inside the military from we won to we are being hunted. Hezbollah transformed itself. They went from being a militia, a guerrilla group taking pot shots,
Something else
to a monster. That's the word they use. A monster that was essentially holding the entire state of Lebanon captive, using it as a human shield and a launch pad.
Monster is such a loaded word. It sounds almost cinematic, not like military jargon. But here it implies something, uncontrollable, something that doesn't follow the rules of a normal army.
That's it, exactly. The intelligence officers in the source use it to describe the sheer scale of the capabilities.
Yeah.
We are not talking about a ragtag group with Kalashnikovs anymore. This was a pseudo-army.
With state-level tech.
State-level capability. We're talking precision missiles that could hit the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, anti-air defense, sophisticated cyber unit, and all of it. Every last bit was intentionally entrenched deep within civilian infrastructure.
And during those years, that long period of quiet between 2006 and 2023, the source describes what the commanders called a game of chess.
A very dangerous game of chess, played with concrete, explosives, and surveillance cameras all along that border fence.
So it's a constant back and forth.
Precisely. A battle of wits, day in and day out. Israel would secure a section of the border. Maybe they'd build a new, higher defensive wall or install a new advanced sensor system.
And Hezbollah's move.
They wouldn't just pack up and go home. They'd build a new observation post right under the IDF's nose, often disguised as something totally innocuous.
Right, like those environmental NGO stations. I remember reading about that.
Green Without Borders, that was the cover they used. They'd put up a tower with a green flag, supposedly for watching birds, but is really watching IDF trolls. Or they'd dig a new tunnel. It was a constant cycle. Israel makes a move, Hezbollah counter. And in that silence, in that so-called containment, Hezbollah was building something massive.
And that massive something has a name that just keeps coming up in the source material again and again. The Radwan.
The Radwan Force. This is absolutely critical to understand. This isn't just their infantry. This is their elite of the elite, their commando unit.
Their tip of the spear.
Exactly. And the source document, 80 ton, it goes into incredible detail about the specific scenario the IDF was preparing. And it's chilling because this wasn't about rocket fire anymore. This was a detailed plan for a full-on invasion.
An invasion of northern Israel. We're talking about taking territory, holding town, planting flags.
Yes. The nightmare scenario they were training for, the one that kept commanders up at night, involved between 2,000 and 3,000 highly trained fighters crossing the border.
Simultaneously.
At multiple points along the fence.
Yeah.
A coordinated, overwhelming assault.
2,000 to 3,000. That's a brigade. That is a massive force to move without being seen, without tipping your hand.
It is. And this is where that stopwatch analogy comes slamming back into view. Because the most terrifying part of this plan wasn't just the number of fighters, as scary as that is. It was the timeline, the battle for time.
Okay, let's unpack this timeline mismatch, because this seems to be the absolute crux of the anxiety that the commanders felt on the ground.
It was everything. The intelligence assessment, which was refined over years of observation, showed that the Radwan Force could launch this attack, get those 3,000 fighters mobilized to the border and across in roughly 6 hours.
6 hours. From a cold start to boots on the ground inside Israel. That's barely a morning shift. It's nothing in terms of military logistics.
It's barely enough time to wake up, realize what's happening, and find your... But here's the catastrophic problem. The IDF's defensive mobilization.
The plan to get the reserve.
The plan to call up the reserve brigades from their homes in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, get them to their bases, get them their gear, and get them to the northern border, fully organized and ready to fight. That was a 36-hour plan.
Whoa! Just stop right there. Let's do the math on that. 6 hours to attack, 36 hours to defend.
That leaves a 30-hour gap.
A 30-hour vacuum.
A vacuum. A black hole in the defense plan. A 30-hour window where the Radwan Force would be rampaging through northern towns, effectively unopposed by the main bulk of the Israeli army. The source quotes commanders who realized this gap was, in their word, fatal. They said, we're losing the battle for time.
So what did they do? You can't just sit on that kind of intelligence. You can't know you have a 30-hour hole in your defense and just hope for the best.
No, you can't. So they started drilling like crazy. The source mentions very specific large-scale drills they conducted in December 2022 and then again in June 2023. The entire purpose of these exercises was to slash that mobilization time.
To close the gap.
to close that deadly gap. And through immense effort, really rethinking their entire call-up process, they managed to get the plan down to between 6 and 12 hours.
That's a massive improvement. I mean, cutting it by 2/3 or more is huge. But still, if Radwan can move in 6 hours, and your best case scenario for reinforcement is 6 hours.
You're tied. And if it's 12 hours...
You're still 6 hours late to the party.
Exactly. And 6 hours is an eternity when you have thousands of commandos storming civilian towns. That was the state of mind on October 6, 2023. They knew the threat was real. They had dramatically improved their speed, but they also knew deep down it might not be enough. They were living on a razor's edge.
And then came the morning of October 7th.
The morning the stopwatch seemed to hit zero for everyone.
The source gives us this incredibly vivid, almost minute-by-minute perspective of the Northern Command. We always, and for good reason, hear about the chaos in the South, but up north, it was a completely different kind of terror. It was the terror of anticipation.
That's a perfect way. The commander we mentioned at the start, he describes sitting in his home, scrolling through Telegram, watching these horrific videos coming out of the Gaza envelope.
Pickup trucks, the paragliders.
The RPGs, the slaughter, and the kibbutzim. And he says he immediately, without a second's thought, superimposed those images onto his own sector. He wasn't seeing Be'eri or Kfar Aza on his screen. In his mind's eye, he was seeing Metil. He was seeing Manara. He was seeing Kiryat Shmona.
He says it so starkly in the source. It is clear in my head that in a second, Radwan is the same thing.
That psychological impact is just, it's profound. You have to put yourself in there. For years, the conception, the prevailing military theory in Israel, was that Hamas was the lesser threat. They were dangerous but manageable.
Hezbollah was the main event.
Hezbollah was the major leaguer, the real existential threat. So the logic was immediate and terrifying. If the minor threat could pull off an invasion of that magnitude, what in God's name could the monster in the north do?
It just shattered their confidence in their own defenses. They realized the walls, the fences, the sensors, it was all permeable.
Completely permeable. And there's this terrifying admission of vulnerability in the source material. The commanders, in those first few hours, realized that if a massive, coordinated invasion happened at that specific moment, on the morning of October 7th, the local forces they had on the line could not stop it, period.
And we hear that from the ground level, too. There's a quote from a local security squad leader. We're talking about, civilian residents, farmers, dentists who volunteer to guard their own towns. And it's just heartbreakingly honest.
It's brutal.
He says, "What do you think I can do against 200 fighters with an M16?
It's a rhetorical question with a deadly serious answer. Not much. You can't hold off a company of trained commandos with a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun from behind a garden wall.
It just highlights that insane disparity. You have a guy, maybe a 50-year-old reservist or just a local dad, staring down the barrel of an elite commando unit that's been training for this single mission for a decade.
And the harsh truth, which the source reveals, is that the official plan for those first few hours was simply to delay. That was the verb.
Not repel, delay.
Delay. They used the morale-boosting phrase, stand strong. But there was no illusion, none whatsoever, that these local squads could physically repel a full-scale invasion of 3,000 men. They were intended to be speed bumps.
Yeah.
Human speed.
So in that moment, the battle for time kicks into the highest possible.
Immediately. And this is crucial. The Northern Command didn't wait for orders from the General Staff in Tel Aviv, who were obviously completely overwhelmed with the disaster in the South.
They took initiative.
They had to. This source describes a frantic, almost desperate mobilization effort. They were on the phone calling commanders, calling soldiers, telling them to drop everything and come north. Now, the goal was to flood the area with troops.
To close that vacuum we talked about.
Exactly. To disrupt that timeline disparity. They needed to put enough boots on the ground, enough tanks, enough artillery, so that Hezbollah would lose the single greatest advantage they had, the element of surprise against an empty field.
They needed to make sure that if Radwan crossed that border, they would hit a wall of soldiers, not just a few brave but outgunned civilians.
Not just a few Iron Ducks.
You mentioned the Iron Ducks. This is one of the most memorable and, frankly, dark stories from the source. It's about a company in Metula, right on the fence.
Yeah, Metula, for anyone looking at a map, is this tiny finger of Israel that pokes right into Lebanon. It's surrounded on 3 sides. It's incredibly vulnerable. And there's a reserve company there, a local one, called Barvazi Habarzel, the Iron Ducks.
It's a great name. It sounds tough, resilient.
It does. It sounds tough. But the source recounts this moment of absolutely grim gallows humor. A senior commander comes to visit the company on the border, to boost morale, and he welcomes them, says something like, "Good to see the Iron Ducks." And the local commander looks him dead in the eye and says, "We aren't Iron Duck. We are sitting ducks in a shooting range."
Ooh, that is dark. That's a level of honesty you don't expect.
It's dark, but it was the truth. They were static targets in a kill zone. But despite that, Despite knowing full well they were sitting ducks, the source makes it clear that these local security teams, these iron ducks, refuse to abandon their town.
Why? I mean, if you know an invasion is not just possible but likely, and you know you're hopelessly outgunned, why stay? It seems like a suicide.
The source really emphasizes this deep, almost primal connection to the land. Many of these local security officers are older men in their 50s or 60s. They viewed the young 20-year-old soldiers arriving as their own children. One of them is quoted saying, "If we aren't here, Hezbollah will just walk right in. Someone has to be the first line."
So it's a sense of duty that goes beyond any military order. It's personal.
It's deeply personal. And they also had a very practical logic. They had seen what happened in the South. They wanted to prevent the looting and total destruction of their home. They knew that if the town was empty, it would be burned to the ground. So they stayed. They served as that first line of defense, knowing full well that if the stopwatch did hit zero, they would be the first to fall.
But here's the incredible twist in the story. The stopwatch didn't zero, at least not in the way they all. The mass invasion from the north, it didn't happen on October 7th.
And this leads us to the million-dollar question that the source and every analyst since has grappled with. Why? Why didn't Nasrallah give the order and join the attack?
It seems like the absolute perfect opportunity. Israel is in chaos, the army is scrambling south, the country is in shock. Why hesitate?
The analysis in the source suggests a couple of critical facts. The first one is simple: surprise.
Nasrallah was surprised, but aren't Hamas and Hezbollah allies? Weren't they coordinating?
They are part of the same axis of resistance, yes, but the assessment from the intelligence officials in the source is that Nasrallah did not know Hamas was capable of pulling off an operation of that scale, that successful.
He underestimated.
He likely viewed Hamas as the junior part, the B team. Seeing them breach that sophisticated border fence so effectively, so brutally, probably caught him completely off guard. He wasn't read in on the full scope.
So in a way, he was watching the news unfold just like everyone else.
Probably with much better intelligence feeds, but essentially, yes. He was reacting, not acting. But the second factor is even more critical, and it ties back to what we were just discussing, the loss of surprise.
Because the IDF in the north mobilized so fast.
Exactly. Remember the time. Hezbollah needs about 6 hours to launch their invasion. By the time Hezbollah's leadership processed what was happening in the south, debated their options, and considered giving the green light, they looked north. What did they see?
A completely different picture than what was there at 6:30 in the morning.
A totally different picture. They saw the IDF's northern command already flooding the area with Merkava tanks, with artillery batteries, with elite infantry units.
So that 30-hour window, it slammed shut in their face.
The element of surprise, which is absolutely 100% critical for an invasion of that type, was gone. It had evaporated. If they attack now, they wouldn't be attacking a few dozen sitting ducks. They would be attacking a fully alert, rapidly reinforcing, and absolutely furious.
So it was a bet they weren't willing to make?
It was a massive strategic bet. The source says that Hezbollah's leadership debated this for weeks. They saw the stunning success in the south, and they were incredibly tempted. But the rapid Israeli defensive deployment forced them into a dilemma. They had missed their golden opportunity.
So instead of a full-scale invasion, we got something else, something slower and maybe even more psychologically taxing.
We got a standoff.
Oh.
And then a grinding, painful, bloody war of attrition that lasted for months and months.
And this brings us to the next section of our deep dive, the long period of living under constant fire. This wasn't a full war in the class, but it certainly wasn't anything resembling.
No, this was this strange, agonizing limbo period for the soldiers and the few remaining residents. The big invasion didn't happen, but the war was definitely on. The source describes this daily reality of anti-tank missile attacks.
Cornet missiles, specifically.
Cornet missiles fired directly into Israeli outposts and even into the empty homes in the evacuated town.
And let's just clarify for you, the listener, a cornet isn't like a simple mortar or a dumb rocket, right? This is a serious piece of hardware.
Oh, far from it. A cornet is a sophisticated laser beam riding anti-tank guided missile. It has a range of over 5 kilometers, incredibly accurate, and its warhead can punch through the heavy armor of a main battle tank, let alone the concrete wall of a house. The simple rule on the border, they can see you, they can hit you.
And for months, the Israeli soldiers just had to take.
The frustration described by the soldiers in the source is just palpable. They talk about being in their outposts, taking fire, seeing the smoke plume from the launch, knowing exactly where it came from, but being told by their commanders to wait.
Wait? That must be the single hardest word for a soldier under direct fire.
Especially when you have the tank, or the drone, or the artillery battery ready to strike back. But the strategic decision from the top at that time was still containment. The political leadership did not want to open a second full-scale front while the war in Gaza was raging at its peak. So the soldiers had to sit in their bunkers, absorbing the hits. day after day.
This source mentions something fascinating here. It calls it a competition of learning. What does that mean in this context of a static defense?
It's the brutal, rapid evolution of survival tactic. In a static war like this, if you do the same thing twice, you die. It's that simple. The source explains that every time a soldier or a unit made a mistake, maybe a soldier exposed his movement for a split second too long, or a vehicle was parked in a known line of sight, or a patrol took the same route to a position, they were hit.
So the enemy's watching constantly, and they're patient.
Constantly watching. And they were deadly accurate. This forced an incredibly rapid sharpening of operational discipline. You learn to move in the shadows. You learn which walls are safe and which are death traps. It was a brutal, unforgiving school, and the tuition was paid in blood and casualties.
But this policy of containment, this strategy of just absorbing fire, it couldn't last forever. There had to be a breaking point, a moment where the calculation changed.
And there was a very specific date, July 27, 2024, a place called Majd al-Sham.
The source identifies this date as the major pivot point of the entire conflict, the moment everything changed. Tell us what happened.
A Hezbollah rocket, a Birkin rocket, which is a heavy, unguided projectile, slammed into a soccer field in the Druze town of Majd al-Sham, which is in the Golan Heights. It killed children who were playing soccer. It was a horrific, gut-wrenching tragedy.
And the source claims this was actually a mistake by Hezbollah, that they weren't aiming for.
Yes, and this is a critical detail. This was seen as a tactical error with massive strategic consequences. The analysis in the source shows they were most likely aiming for Camp Snur, a major military base on Mount Dov nearby.
So they overshot the target.
They overshot. The rocket flew over the ridge where the base is located and landed on the village behind it. They intended to hit soldiers, and they killed children instead.
And that error, it changed everything.
It changed the entire equation. The source says this tragedy provided the political legitimacy and the moral imperative for Israel to finally change the rules of the game.
That was the moment the policy of containment.
It was the moment the leadership in Israel and the public decided we cannot live with this monster on our border anymore. The cost of trying to manage it is too high. The old equation of quiet for quiet was over forever.
And this decision leads us directly to one of the most astonishing and, frankly, terrifying intelligence operations in modern history, the pager operation.
This is where the story truly shifts from a grinding war of attrition to a precise, surgical dismantling of the enemy. And what's amazing is that the source reveals that discussions inside Israeli intelligence about using this specific capability began as early as April 2024.
Wait, April? So they had this incredible card up their sleeve for months.
Yes, for at least 5 months. They were just debating when to play it. It was seen as kind of doomsday weapon. Not nuclear, of course, but in terms of its intelligence. Once you use it, the capability is burned forever. The element of surprise is gone. They were saving it for the most decisive moment possible.
So for anyone who might have somehow missed the global headline, just describe the operation as the source lays it out for us.
In the simplest terms, it was a simultaneous remote detonation of the batteries inside communication devices, mostly pagers, but also some handheld radios, carried by thousands of Hezbollah operatives across Lebanon and even Syria.
Boom. All at once. A coordinated, invisible attack.
All at once. A silent signal sent out, and then chaos. But the source focuses heavily, and I think correctly, on the psychological impact, which was perhaps even more devastating than the thousands of physical injuries.
The paranoia it must...
Unimaginable paranoia. Imagine you're a member of a clandestine hierarchical organization like Hezbollah. You rely on secrecy for your very life. Suddenly, the device in your pocket, your secure, trusted line to your commanders, explodes and tries to kill you.
The trust gone.
The source paints this vivid picture of the aftermath. Terrorists were afraid to answer their phone. They were afraid to start their cars, thinking the ignition might be rigged. They refused to use their walkie-talkies.
It's the sense of persecution.
That's the exact phrase the source used. They felt completely exposed, naked. Hezbollah prides itself on its security, on being an impenetrable organization. And in one afternoon, they realized that Israel wasn't just at their border. Israel was literally in their pockets.
The source has a great line about it. It describes it as hitting the enemy in the worst way, where they didn't know how much they were hit.
That's it. They didn't know the limits of the compromise. Was it just the pagers? Or was it the phones, too? The computers, the cars, the walls themselves. It created total command and control paralysis. They couldn't coordinate. They couldn't issue orders. They were deaf and dumb. And into that chaos, Israel struck with precision.
This is what the source calls the dismantling.
Yes. A rapid succession of targeted strikes in the hours and days that followed. Because the operatives were in disarray, and because they were forced to try and find alternative, less secure ways to communicate, they exposed themselves.
They came out of the shadows.
And the IDF, using signals intelligence, hunted down dozens of mid-level and senior-level commanders who were now vulnerable for the first time in years.
And this phase culminated in the elimination of the man himself, the head of the snake, Hassan Nasrallah.
The ultimate target. The source describes the situation leading up to his death as a perfect storm of his own making. Nasrallah was isolated, Think about it. His direct command chain was gone. The senior Radwan commanders had been killed in a targeted strike shortly before the pager incident. His communication network was completely compromised. His fire capabilities were being systematically destroyed from the air.
He was effectively alone in his bunker.
Alone, and according to the source's analysis, stuck in a fatal misconception.
Another conception failure. It seems to be a theme.
A recurring tragic theme in the region. Just as Israel had a conception about Hamas being deterred, Nasrallah had a conception about Israel. He truly believed, based on 18 years of experience, that Israel was weak, internally divided, and ultimately unwilling to go to total war. He thought the rules of the game were still tit for tat.
He didn't realize the game had changed.
He didn't realize the game had changed until the roof of his command bunker caved in on him.
The source calls that specific strike a defining moment.
It was. It was the moment the IDF was given the final approval to cross the wall, to stop managing the threat, to stop containing it, and to start eliminating it from the head down.
So the head is gone. The communications network is in ruin. But the thousands of rockets, the physical hardware of terror are still there, hidden in villages. And that brings us to Operation Northern Arrow.
The massive, overwhelming aerial campaign. The statistics cited in the source are just staggering. In one single day, September 23, 2024, the Israeli Air Force dropped nearly 2,000 munitions on targets in Lebanon.
2,000. In 24 hours, that's an unbelievable sortie rate. It's a scale of air power we haven't seen in decades.
It's a staggering display of force. And the result, according to the damage assessment, was that they destroyed over 70% of Hezbollah's effective fire capabilities, their long-range rockets, their precision missiles, in that initial blitz.
But I have to ask the difficult question here, the one that always comes up. Hezbollah is infamous for storing their rockets in civilian houses, schools, hospitals. How do you drop 2,000 bombs without causing massive, indiscriminate civilian casualties?
And this is a key point the source makes regarding the shift in strategy since 2006. This operation was conducted after a massive, well-publicized effort to evacuate the civilian population in southern Lebanon. Israel dropped leaflets, sent text messages, made radio broadcasts telling people to leave for their own safety.
So they cleared the board before flipping the table over.
That's a great way to put it. This allowed for heavy, powerful strikes on the infrastructure, the houses that had been turned into missile launchers, the warehouses disguised as grocery stores, with what the source claims were minimized civilian casualties on the enemy side. It was a systematic, brutal destruction of the monsters.
But air power can only do so much. You can bomb a rocket launcher, but you can't bomb an ideology. And you certainly can't bomb a hidden tunnel network that's been designed for invasion.
And that is precisely why the ground maneuver was inevitable. The source is crystal clear on this point. Air power alone is not enough to remove the threat of a ground invasion. You need boots on the ground to physically find, enter, and destroy that infrastructure.
The spirit of the breach.
That's the term the source uses for the soldiers at that moment. You have to remember, these are reservists who've been sitting on that border waiting for months. Remember the frustration we talked about earlier? That agonizing waiting while under fire?
Now they were finally being given the green light.
They were unleashed. They crossed the border with a very specific, very difficult object: to find and dismantle what the IDF calls the nature reserves.
Nature reserve. Sounds so full, so pastoral. I'm assuming we aren't talking about hiking trail spot.
No, it's a military code word for these heavily fortified bunker complex that Hezbollah built, hidden in the thick brush, the forest, and the rocky terrain of southern Lebanon. They are interconnected networks of launch sites, tunnels, command posts, weapon caches, all built for one purpose: to support that Radwan invasion force.
And what did the soldiers find when they actually went into these villages and reserves? Was the intelligence accurate, as bad as they thought?
The source describes the soldiers entering these Lebanese villages and finding everything. It was worse than they thought. In some areas, they reported finding not a single house that was not being used for terror infrastructure.
Every single house. That sounds like hyperbole.
That's the claim in the source, from the commanders on the ground. A Grad rocket launcher in the living room, a tunnel shaft hidden under a rug in a garage, a crate of anti-tank missiles in the kitchen pantry. It completely validated the monster theory. The entire civilian village, in many cases, had become a military base.
It really drives home why that air campaign wasn't enough on its own. You can't see a tunnel shaft in a garage from an F-35 flying at 30,000 feet.
No. You have to go in there, you have to kick down the door, and that's what they did. They went house to house, tunnel to tunnel, bunker to bunker, physically dismantling the invasion capability piece by painstaking piece.
So we've gone on this whole journey, from the absolute terror of October 7th to the pagers, to the massive airstrikes, and finally to the ground invasion. Let's zoom out now. Let's do the retrospective analysis. What does this all mean for the equation that governed this border for so?
The equation is the core concept here. For 18 years, the equation was simple, if brutal. Hezbollah attacks, Israel responds proportionately. They fire an anti-tank missile, Israel shells the launch site. It was a tit for tat.
Yeah.
a balance of terror.
And that's gone.
Completely shattered. The consensus expert view in the source is that Israel's leadership and its people decided they simply could not live with a monster on their border anymore. The events of October 7th in the south proved definitively that containment is a myth. You cannot contain a monster that is ideologically committed to eating you. Eventually, it breaks the cage.
So the new reality is
What?
total removal of the threat.
The new reality is active prevention. The source mentions that the risk in the north after October 7th became intolerable. It was no longer a risk that could be managed or contained. It had to be removed. They couldn't go back to the way things were.
We talked about Nasrallah's conception failing him, but the source also spends a lot of time talking about something it calls the battle for spirit. What is that?
This is the human element, and it's so important. Wars aren't just fought with smart bombs and tanks. They're fought with human will. The source goes to great lengths to highlight the incredible resilience of the Israeli reservists.
These are just ordinary guys, programmers, farmers, teachers who left their businesses, their families, their entire lives on a moment's notice.
For months on end, sitting in muddy bunkers, getting shelled every day, not knowing when or if they would go home, not knowing when the real war would start. The battle for spirit was that internal psychological struggle to maintain the motivation to fight, to not break under the immense pressure of that waiting period.
And the source argues the spirit was just as important as the military tactics or the technology.
Absolutely. Because if the spirit of the army breaks, the army itself breaks. No amount of advanced weaponry can fix that. But they held on. They maintained the will to eventually launch the offensive when the order came. The source really frames it as a testament to the internal fortitude of that society during its darkest crisis.
It has been quite a journey to trace, from that terrified commander watching the wall just waiting for it to load,
To the Iron Ducks in Metula, refusing to leave their home, becoming those sitting ducks.
to the intelligence masterstroke of the pagers that stunned the entire world.
And finally, to the decisive, bloody ground maneuver that was designed to clear the threat, once and for all.
It's a story of a country being pushed to the brink and then turning the tables. But as we wrap up this deep dive, we have to ask the hard question. The source ends with a very provocative, very unsettling thought.
Knowledge is valuable when applied.
Right? And the question that leaves you with is this permanent? Is this victory, this new equation, last?
And that is the lingering shadow over this whole story. If this monster was allowed to grow, to metastasize for 18 years, from 2006 to 2024, right under everyone's noses while everyone said the border was quiet, what guarantees that the weeding done now will last?
Weeds have a nasty habit of growing back, especially in that part of the world.
They do. And the source reflects on this deeply cyclical nature of the region. There's an old saying, a day for us, a day for our enemies. History in the Middle East is rarely a straight line forward. It's often a circle.
So the military capability has been smashed. Nasrallah is gone. The bunkers are blown up. But the ideology, the intent
Almost certainly remains. And that means the vigilance required to prevent the monster from growing back must be eternal. The stopwatch has been reset, but it has not been thrown away. It's still there, on the table.
That is a very sobering thought. Stopwatches tick.
Always.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Third Lebanon War. It's a complex, incredibly heavy topic, but understanding this fundamental shift from containment, decisive action is absolutely crucial to understanding the world we live in today.
Absolutely. It's a lesson in the terrible cost of hesitation and the impossibly high price of security.
We'll see you next time.